%80 of these things after investigation can be explained as misidentifications. In 15% of cases, there's probably insufficient information to be sure. 5%, very interesting. And into that 5% go sort of cases where UFOs have been seen by commercial airline pilots, by military personnel, sometimes by RAF pilots. Cases where these things have been tracked on civil and sometimes military radar, performing extraordinary speeds and manoeuvres.
Definitely, the majority of all UFO reports can be explained in conventional terms. You know, we forget that the acronym UFO stands for Unidentified Flying Object, and unfortunately, it's become synonymous with alien spaceship. But of the unexplained cases, of which there are hundreds of thousands, there have been millions of UFO reports, we know that, worldwide. There are hundreds of thousands which are unexplained, and the best ones for me, the ones I find the most convincing, are from qualified observers such as astronauts, military and civilian pilots, air traffic controllers, because we forget that many UFO reports have been corroborated by radar, and even if the pilots and air traffic controllers have been drinking, radar sets normally are abstemious in that respect.
I can't rule out the idea of extraterrestrial visitation. I'd had no interest in the subject, certainly no belief, so I went in there really not knowing what to expect. But I must admit that some of the things that I saw, both in terms of the old files, the ones that are now being released, and of course the day-to-day business of the investigations on the new cases as they came in, that convinced me that by the end of that tour of duty, I thought, well, I still don't know what UFOs are, but there is more to this than just misidentifications of aircraft lights and weather balloons, even though by volume that accounts for most of it.
Well, I was sent this extraordinary book, The Flying Saucers Are Real, by Major Donald Keyhoe. It was sent to me by a cousin in America who knew of my passion for aviation and space travel for as long as I can remember. I think there's something in my mother's baby book to the effect that at the age of a few months old, Timothy seems unnaturally fascinated by all manner of flying objects. But I've always been mad about aircraft and space travel, so it was a natural progression. And especially when I read that it was pilots and, as I say, both military and civilian and air traffic controllers were confirming these things, so that really clinched it for me.
I've never seen a UFO, let alone anything more exotic in an Air Force hangar.
No spooky experiences at all?
No, not really, but in a sense I think that kind of gives me an advantage, because it means that as somebody who used to have this as a job for the government, as somebody who now commentates on it in the media and writes about it for the newspapers, for example, I can do so in a fairly dispassionate way, and I can sort of say, look, I'm not some believer trying to ram a view down people's throats, but this was my job, I did this for the government, this is what I know. Well,
I've selected from my book what for me is one of the most compelling images of an unknown flying craft that I've ever seen. It was taken in 1963 by an Avenza Airlines, that's Venezuelan Airlines pilot, sitting in the right-hand seat as the first officer. He took it through the window with his camera, showing a craft, its shadow on the jungle beneath, and the aircraft shadow is also quite clearly visible, that of a DC-4, and you can see part of the engine, what's called the spinner, of this four-engined airliner. And the photograph has been analyzed by professional topographers and mathematicians, despite the fact it was debunked almost as soon as it had appeared by all sorts of people who were either ignorant or were professional debunkers. And I've made my own tests on it using an actual model of a craft and an airliner. This picture was taken in 1951 in California with a camera which was mounted on a plate, on a telescope. It could only be used in conjunction with a telescope.
Okay.
So very, very difficult to fake. And it shows a craft which is estimated to be anything from 1,500 feet in length, and some smaller craft which were seen to leave it, which appear to be surrounded by some kind of corona, which many physicists believe is a corona of plasma associated with the propulsion system of some of these objects.
On May 2008, the chief astronomer from the Vatican said that the existence of extraterrestrials actually didn't contradict church teaching. And then on the 23rd of July, we had Dr. Edgar Mitchell, who was the sixth man to walk on the moon, actually saying that there had been a cover-up, that he had been briefed, and that Roswell really did happen.
This is really turning into be what I've called Summer of the Saucers. You've mentioned in your intro there a couple of the things that have happened, these extraordinary statements that we've had, but there's been much more. In May this year, the Ministry of Defence, where I worked for 21 years, started what's going to be a 3 to 4 year process to release its entire archive. The Vatican statement that you mentioned happened within about 2 days of that.
Roswell, I mean, that's a massive topic that everybody always wants to talk about.
Yes.
What are your feelings on that?
Well, it definitely happened. There's dispute about some of the sites where the craft crashed. Some people say there was more than one craft, too. My own information from my own clandestine sources is that at least one craft was actually shot down by the United States Army Air Forces.
Okay.
And it took several days before it came down. And according to this particular source who gave me this information, who I've actually named in the book, he's a former state representative for New Mexico and a former aerospace engineer, he said a colleague of his actually saw one of these recovered craft, and he could see the entry holes for the particular caliber of ammunition that would have been used to bring this craft down. And this led to an extraordinary conflict, if I can only describe it as that, because not just in the United States, but all over the world, following that incident, the UFOs, or some of them, began to attack our aircraft. And many, even airliners, not just military planes, but many airliners were lost during this conflict situation. And I believe it's a conflict situation which continues to this day to some extent. That's not to say they're all hostile by any means. The Aztec case in 1948, which was actually far more impressive than the Roswell case, in my opinion. A craft about 100 feet in diameter was recovered by military intelligence and scientific intelligence specialists, and I've been to the actual crash site where this thing came down, practically all in one piece, and the Americans acquired a tremendous amount of technological information from that craft. It was in March of 1948, and many witnesses, actually there have been sort of deathbed confessions, which have been reported and witnessed by Scott Ramsey and his wife Suzanne, who are planning a book on this case. And I've done a chapter about it in Need to Know. And many scientists were involved. They eventually managed to get into this craft through a hole in one of the portholes. Again, this implies to me that it was perhaps shot down. And there were, I think, quite a number of small alien bodies which were charred. They were all deceased, and they all had apparently died as a result of exposure to the atmosphere, which had obviously got in through one of the cabins.
But you've also said that you believe that there are aliens living among us.
Absolutely, yes. I mean, I think...
So how come some of them are dying and some of them are absolutely fine?
Because there are different levels of evolution. My information is that this is nothing new about aliens, and you know, the Hindu Vedas, the Brahmin records, the Bible talks about extraordinary beings coming out of the sky in flying machines, and I know they're often referred to as angels in the Bible, for example, but they're usually described as having the appearance of a man. And that's a quote from one of the Old Testament reports.
Well, yeah, the book of Genesis is kind of full of Elohim and
Absolutely.
The sons of God saw peoples of the skies coming down. And
that's a very good quote, actually. The sons of God saw the daughters of men that they were fair and came in unto them. You can't get more graphic than that. And I think that is a very early reference to hybridization. I think we are a hybridized species. I think some of these beings have been on planet Earth for much longer than we have, and we were colonized. Edgar Mitchell, I know, and I've discussed his opinions about the subject, and as many of you out there will know, about 5 or 6 weeks ago he was reported in the national media that, you know, there's been a massive cover-up since the 1940s, and that contact has been established.
But I mean, actually, he's been saying this for years, but this was the first time he said it quite so pointedly.
Yes.
But yes, I mean,
correct, you're absolutely right about that. And
yeah.
he's even emphasized, you know, I've been saying this for years, but suddenly it's picked up and it becomes a news item.
So how long have you known Dr. Edgar Mitchell?
I've met him once. I've corresponded with him over, I would say, about 6 or 7 years.
Okay. And your opinion of him is that...
He's absolutely, totally reliable, in my opinion, and a very brave man to come forward. It's very interesting. In Need to Know, I have the report from Buzz Aldrin that Apollo 11 was actually paced on the way to the moon in July of 1969. And he's since sort of changed his statement to a certain extent, but he made it on a British television documentary, and it was supported by Dr. David Baker, Apollo 11 senior scientist, that there was a craft which was beside the vehicle, Apollo 11. It was bell-shaped when looked at through the monocular, through the cabin windows, and all the crew members saw it.
There are certainly some very, very big hitters in America, and indeed here in Britain, who have said, yeah, very much we believe that this is a real phenomenon. Recently, of course, in the presidential campaign, one of the candidates, Dennis Kucinich, it was revealed that he'd seen a UFO, actually at Shirley MacLaine's house, so that's a nice little tie-in.
One wonders what they were getting up to.
Then Fife Symington, who's a former two-term governor of the state of Arizona, said in relation to a very famous wave of UFO sightings that happened in Phoenix in 1997, he said, not only, he said, was this absolutely real, and I was governor at the time, he recently said, but I saw it too. And the really interesting thing is that...
Didn't he deny it at the time when he was in office?
This was really famous. He held a press conference where he said, we found the culprit, and out onto stage came his chief of staff dressed up in an alien suit. So he debunked the whole thing. He has now said, look, I'm really sorry that I did that. He said, but things were getting out of hand. There was mass hysteria. Hundreds of calls were coming in.
But isn't that precisely why we're not going to get a major statement by a government, because they wouldn't want to take responsibility for, as you've spoken about, perhaps the ensuing panic?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think, you know, that situation was quite extraordinary. I think one of the other problems, if there is some big secret that the government or several governments are going to release, one of the problems is actually a constitutional one, because it's one thing to say, we've found alien life and here it is. The problem is, but we've been lying to you about it for 60 years by previously denying it. So that's a constitutional problem.
Dr. Edgar Mitchell, the sixth man to walk on the moon, and he was on, I believe, 3 of the Apollo missions. Graduated from MIT, one of the most highly regarded astronauts of our time. Surely what he says is credible, but then wasn't there a statement released by the American government, or was it?
NASA released a statement,
right.
Yes, and NASA, obviously for the reasons you've said, this guy is an all-American hero. You have to be very, very careful in America about making any criticisms of the astronauts. NASA said, it was a very interesting statement, they said, Dr. Edgar Mitchell is a great American, but we do not agree with him on this issue.
Right.
Then Edgar Mitchell was, and they went on to say, NASA isn't covering up the truth about UFOs. Edgar Mitchell turned round when he was quizzed about this afterwards and said, yeah, but it's not NASA that have the lead on this. NASA probably don't even know about this, some of this stuff. He says that a lot of this is more a sort of cabal of people from different agencies.
Right.
More of
like
kind of...
the Illuminati or something.
Something like that, yeah.
Right.
As opposed to one entire agency that knows all about this and is covering it up.
This is a secret club of all different types of agencies.
A person here, a person there, key people in maybe a number of different agencies. This is what he's saying, but he claims to have sources at very, very high level in the Pentagon and elsewhere. And let's face it, if you were actually going to confide in someone, and people can't keep secrets, an astronaut is exactly the sort of thing, the sort of person that you would probably tell about UFO secrets. It's very difficult with these things. He may be deliberately trying to muddy the trail a bit, and the one thing I know, not least from my 21 years in government, is that if you get questions about your sources, you have to be very careful, and sometimes you actually have to throw in the odd red herring.
I mean, if there is some kind of secret society of people in the know, are you part of that society?
Well, you see, this is where I can't win. I've been accused of being a disinformation agent, but you see, if I say to you, look, actually, Frankie, I'm not, you know, the viewers, the real die-hard conspiracy theorists who think that aren't going to suddenly go, thanks, Nick, for clearing that up. They're going to go, well, he would say that, wouldn't he? So I can't win.
Well, you would say that, wouldn't you?
Well, I would, yes.
Is a cover-up, which is obviously what you believe, who is responsible and why the secrecy?
Well, the cover-up goes back really to, I would say, towards the end of the Second World War. Because, you know, people have heard about the so-called Foo Fighters, which appeared during the war to the Axis pilots, to US Army Air Forces, Royal Air Force, German, Japanese, often described as fuzzy blobs. But in fact, there were sightings of enormous craft, such as the one in my book, which was a giant object seen by the entire crew of a Lancaster bomber, which all affected them at the time. And that information has never been released officially.
Okay, so very briefly, do you think the UK is in a cover-up?
Definitely.
So it's
most
not just
definitely.
The US?
The way it was put to me quite a long time ago by a former director of MI6 was, Timothy, I think you'll find we leave that to the Americans.
If you get questions about your sources, you have to be very careful, and sometimes you actually have to throw in the odd red herring.
The way it was put to me quite a long time ago by a former director of MI6 was, Timothy, I think you'll find we leave that to the Americans.
Who is responsible and why the secrecy?
A la misma altura. Hay unas nubes ahí, se debe de ver.
I mean, there is certainly a body of people who believe that many of the cutting-edge scientific discoveries that we've seen in recent decades actually came from the UFO that crashed at Roswell. And there are many people who believe that this technology is gradually being seeded out through, of course, predominantly American companies to get the technology out there, but to make sure America maintains the advantage.
Just to bring it back to the subject, Dr. Edgar Mitchell said that absolutely Roswell did happen.
Yes.
And he should know, he's been on the moon and 3 Apollo missions.
Well, yes, I mean, that is interesting, and of course it's not just Edgar Mitchell. Recently there's been a lot of so-called deathbed testimony from the last few people who were actually there when Roswell happened in July of 1947, including Walter Haut, the public relations officer at the Army base, and he, in a signed affidavit that came out recently, said yes, it was real, there was a crashed spaceship, there were aliens.
Is there anyone awake here?
Corso, who wrote The Day After Roswell. I mean, what's your take on him?
Yeah, Lieutenant Colonel Philip Corso, I never met him, but I found a lot of his testimony credible. Unfortunately, the book was edited by William Burns, who injected a few slight inaccuracies in it, and I know that Corso himself was not happy about that because he told a friend of mine. For example, he said, Corso, that they actually waited until American the industrial corporations were actually beginning to get a handle on some of these advanced technologies before passing over the materials that had been recovered from Roswell and perhaps elsewhere. So that was one of the most important things he wanted to put across. I know many people have said that, oh, we found that he wasn't on the National Security Council. Well, he wasn't on the National Security Council, but I've got his military records, and they show that he was on the National Security Council's intelligence staff for quite a few years as an intelligence officer, and he was involved with a special coordinations board which dealt with some of the most sensitive clandestine operations mounted by the United States government. So, you know, he did have a very, very good intelligence background.
Before Roswell, I mean, you speak about kind of aircraft crashes
Yes.
In the 40s.
Yes. Now, this is, I think, one of the main reasons for the cover-up. One of them, certainly at that time, for heaven's sakes, was that when the Americans, with the German scientists headed by Werner von Braun at White Sands Proving Ground, started test launching the captured Nazi V-2 rockets, the UFOs increased their surveillance, and they started buzzing the rockets, and in several cases causing them actually to crash or come down to Earth prematurely. And one of these instances was actually officially confirmed in a local newspaper, which I've reproduced in the book. And the director of the White Sands missile base says that unexplained phenomena were responsible for bringing down the rocket. Now, what happened then was the Americans renewed their effort to try and get one of these craft or more down for evaluation. They succeeded, and all hell let loose, because all over the world, not just in the United States, aircraft crashes, many completely unexplained crashes, not just military planes sent to intercept UFOs, which were being reported in the press every day at that time, but worldwide, and civilian airliners. And typically, what happened was planes would be able to get off the ground. In aviation terms, they call that unsticking, unable to get off the ground, and would crash either at the end of the runway or shortly after takeoff, killing passengers. So it's not just military planes. And the official explanation invariably was the aircraft ran out of fuel. How many planes run out of fuel just after taking off? You know, it just doesn't make up. But nobody really questioned it too much at that time. But an emergency situation was declared by President Truman at the time. And this started in around April, May of 1947. And there have been...
So how many of these crashes were there?
Well, I don't know the exact figures, but I know now the Defense Department figures from 1952 to 1956. There were 18,662 crashes, of which 9.5% were unexplained. And that's 1,773 crashes which were due, as it says officially, to unexplained causes, unknown causes. I know from my own sources that quite a number of solid craft have been recovered. I know that communications have been established since the early 1940s with select individuals in the military and intelligence community, very occasionally within governments, such as a few presidents have had contact. So the proof is all there. As to evidence, there is excellent evidence that we have in the civilian world of actual craft. I've produced color photographs of an apparent alien in my last book, Unearthly Disclosure, photographs taken in Italy in 1993, which I'm convinced are absolutely genuine.
But you didn't see the real thing?
I didn't see the real thing.
Oops,
but
because it could be slightly paper mache. Sorry, my ear thing.
It could be, but I hired a forensic scientist who works for the police on imagery to study the photographs, which were Polaroids, and I made copies from the original. I examined the originals myself. And furthermore, the witness had, on one occasion, a close-up sighting encounter with this creature when it was photographed. So that's the best I can come up with, but, you know, believe me, they've got a lot of better information hidden behind closed doors. You know, one of my friends, and the chap who actually wrote the foreword to my latest book, Bill Gunston, is arguably the world's leading aviation historian, and he is convinced that there's no way the Germans could have produced advanced circular flying craft during World War II. They were certainly testing circular flying machines, but there's no way they could have been responsible for all the Foo Fighter sightings and sightings of much larger objects. Had the Germans been responsible, they would have won the war.
Right, but do you think the Germans at that point perhaps had contact with the extraterrestrials as well?
No, I've heard this rumor. I don't discount it. I think later on, certainly, there was contact established with German scientists, particularly those working on the United States space program. But as to earlier than that, I very much doubt it. And I think a lot of material has come out via Nazi propagandists about Hitler escaping to South America and, you know, with fleets of flying saucers and with a base in Antarctica and so forth.
Right, and something else that I found really interesting was you spoke about Kennedy's trip, President Kennedy's trip to see the alien bodies.
Yes.
I mean, sorry, would you mind elaborating for our viewers on that?
No. I was informed by a reliable source attached to JFK's source, White House staff, that in 1961, 1962, John Kennedy requested the observation of actual alien bodies, which he had learned had been recovered by the military. And his wish was granted, and he was taken on Air Force One. The plane was full of generals. It was led by General McHugh, was in charge of the operation. It was a top secret mission. Kennedy saw the bodies. He was taken to Tyndall Air Force Base in Florida, and the bodies were located at a special medical facility at that site.
I mean, do you think that had something to do with his assassination?
I don't know, but there are several pointers that might indicate some truth to that rumor. Like the rumors associated with Marilyn Monroe, I don't discount those either. There are some very strange things about her.
So you believe Marilyn Monroe was murdered?
I don't know, but I'm very suspicious about the suicide, particularly since she was connected with both Kennedys, JFK and his brother. So there is some possibility there for a good conspiracy theory. My information is that there are some highly advanced craft, some of them spacecraft, which certainly the Americans and maybe one or two other governments, I don't know yet, but certainly the Americans are flying, and I think they've been in service for quite some time. And of course this gives rise to all sorts of questions about unidentified flying objects. Just how many of the above top secret craft that the Americans have are normally seen in you know, unrestricted areas is very questionable, but I think some sightings must relate to that. Now, as to what type of technology is involved, I believe it involves anti-gravity and highly sophisticated means of transport. In 1993, Ben Rich, who headed the Skunk Works, Lockheed Martin's Skunk Works, which developed the stealth F-117 plane, said in the presence of two friends of mine at the University of California, that we have the technology now to go to the stars. He confirmed this, but he also said that all this is hidden in above top secret black budget programs, and he said it would take an act of God to bring this out into the civilian world for the benefit of humanity. So that's very interesting. In 1993, here's a man who was in a position to know, who says that we already have the technology, short of a few equations, he said, in 1993, I hasten to add. Now, the sketch beneath this photograph of a Japan Airlines cargo plane was made by the pilot of this Jumbo 747 in 1986 following the sighting of a gigantic UFO near Anchorage, which was also tracked on radar. And there below is his sketch of this walnut-shaped object. And I don't know if viewers can see, but the size of the plane underneath it, to the right underneath the rim, the lip of the craft, for comparison, shows that it absolutely dwarfed. This was an enormous object, and it was seen by the entire crew, and as I say, tracked on radar, and that was confirmed by civil aviation authorities and the CIA, who tried to discredit the story.
You have a number of sources which you keep referring to. I mean, are all of these sources, do they kind of speak off the record? Do some of them wish to remain anonymous?
Some of them speak definitely off the record, that's for sure. Others feel that certain information, the time has come to reveal this information. And I'm not the only reporter, if you like. I'm a professional writer of books, not a journalist as such, though I have written articles for newspaper, but I hold a press card. And I know that a number of very distinguished journalists in the United States, for example, have been given some of the basics of this information, so that it's not as if we're all going to be completely unprepared. But it's not just in the United States, by the way, where I have acquired information.
So where else in the world have you acquired this information?
Well, I'd rather not say, actually, but certain countries.
Okay, so would you say that some countries are more forthcoming than others?
I would definitely say that, yes.
Okay, but you're unable to say which countries?
And I would say also that the information I get is very, very occasional, and it's really like fitting pieces to a jigsaw.
But do you kind of vet all of your sources? I mean, can someone
Absolutely.
just turn up and say, I work for the
I have to be
military?
very, very, very careful, and I usually check out their credentials and I'm often introduced through somebody else. You need very, very high security clearances to get anywhere near these programs, which include an alien liaison program. Contact has been established.
But you've managed to get close enough to amass all this wealth of information.
Yes, I have.
So surely it can't be that difficult. I mean, you've been...
No, and it's not just military and scientific intelligence personnel who've had contact. People from all walks of life, and I hasten to emphasize that. All walks of life, not just farmers in the outback, have had communications with extraterrestrials. I would say tens of thousands. Take 1954, for example, Air Marshal Sir Peter Horsley. He was Deputy Chief of Strike Command with his finger on the nuclear trigger at the time. He was an equerry, a military attaché for the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh for 7 years at Buckingham Palace when this event happened to him. Now, first of all, he actually at some time in the 50s was working in the Ministry of Defense Operations Room dealing with UFOs and collaborating with the Americans, and he could never get near their top secrets. But he claims to have had a 2-hour meeting with an extraterrestrial human being in the middle of London, arranged for him via a British Army general.
Fabulous.
And I spoke to him at great length about that, and I'm convinced he was telling the truth. And one of the most disturbing things he found during that encounter was that this alien knew all Britain's top secret nuclear secrets and knew everything that was in Sir Peter's mind. When the wall came down, late '88 I think it was, I was invited to the former Soviet Union, and I appeared on television. And they were very, very open about the subject. I was talking about all sorts of things for at least a half an hour on a live program in St. Petersburg. It's very interesting. In 1977, this is not generally known, that a 10 to 12-year top-secret program to investigate UFOs by the military was established by President Andropov. this was initiated in 1977 by President Yuri Andropov, who used to be, for much longer than he was president, head of the KGB. That's the Soviet CIA. And he initiated this program because the military was getting gravely concerned about the intrusion of UFOs, and 4 million soldiers were involved throughout the territories of the Soviet Union to investigate. They were told to look for them, to take down details of any reports and so forth and pass it up the line. And it was classified top secret code word. Top secret Institute 22 was the additional code word to that program.
Top secret with 4 million people involved.
4 million soldiers, and the information did not come out until about 10 years ago.
Do you agree with David Icke's work?
I don't think so. Does he write about UFOs? I don't think so.
Yeah, he writes about UFOs and reptilians.
Oh, reptilian aliens. I find it very hard to take that seriously, I have to say.
So you do believe in aliens, but not reptilian aliens?
There have been a few sightings of aliens with reptilian-type skin, yes. But as to aliens inhabiting human bodies, I don't buy it.
Okay.
I have no evidence for it. I've never learnt that myself from my own investigations.
So what's your opinion on chemtrails?
Well, I have to say, I've no doubt that chemicals have been sprayed for various purposes at various times, but to the great height involved to spray chemicals from aircraft at thousands of feet up, 30,000 feet or more, is absurd, because the particles would dissipate. There's absolutely no way they can target anything like that. So I'm totally unconvinced by that, I'm afraid.
What about alien abduction?
Definitely, people have been abducted. That's the bottom line. Probably tens of thousands of people, maybe millions. I don't know the figure. We know that, just like UFOs, the majority can be explained. There are an awful lot of wannabes in the abduction field. You know, it's become a little bit of an iffy subject, but people have definitely been abducted.
Alien abduction is I always think, related but separate to the UFO issue. But yes, I think I've certainly come across people, whether they're claiming alien abduction or actually, even if it's just a fairly up-close and personal UFO sighting, I've come across people who are clearly shocked by it, and in some cases, I think, yes, suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder.
What do you think of hypnotherapy and kind of regression therapy as a means of dealing with alien abduction?
I'm glad you raised that, Frankie. I think this is, I feel very strongly about this. I think that hypnotherapy, hypnotic regression can be a very useful tool, but it should be used by qualified people. It's possible, if you're dealing with someone who is mentally deluded, you are enhancing their delusions. You really need to know what you're doing medically, I think.
One of my other questions as well is animal mutilation.
Yeah.
I mean, do you believe that that's a real
Definitely.
phenomenon?
I've investigated them personally in the United States and in Puerto Rico, Commonwealth of the United States. They are happening, they're still happening, mostly in Argentina and Chile at the moment. I don't have all the explanations, but having spoken to a police officer in Puerto Rico who actually shot one of the creatures responsible for the mutilations, the so-called chupacabras, or goatsucker, shot it at, like from a range of 5 or 6 feet when it was trying to kill his dog. I have no doubt that these creatures exist, and that those are some of the creatures associated with the animal mutilations. As to the purpose of it, I don't know. I guess they need materials.
We're going to try it. Roger.
I would say I'd had about 4 encounters with aliens in my life, which
what kind of
proved to me human-appearing aliens, but certain very hardly noticeable differences. The first was in the United States in 1963. The second was in New York in 1967, when I actually sat down next to one of these beings. I mean, I don't know if we have time to go into the story, but...
I think we do. I mean, how did you know it was an alien? Or he, she was an alien?
There's a little background to it. I was actually with the London Symphony Orchestra at the time, doing a series of concerts with the London Symphony Orchestra and Rostropovich, the great cellist. And one afternoon, I attempted a telepathic experiment, because I'd been talking to people who claimed to have had regular meetings in Washington with extraterrestrials. So I sent out the thought, if any of you guys from elsewhere are around, come down and sit down next to me and prove it. Well, you know, various people came and went. I was sitting in the hotel lobby at the time. And eventually this guy comes in, about 5'10". He was immaculately dressed, slightly tanned, slightly wavy, fair hair. He had an attaché case. He sat down next to me. From the attaché case, very sort of deliberately took out New York Times. He went through the pages, turned them like this, gradually folded the newspaper, put it back in the attaché case. I said to him in my mind, if you're the guy I'm looking for, take your right index finger and hold it to the right side of your nose. Instantly, he did just that and kept it there. So I was dumbfounded. I thought, well, what do I do next? He's going to talk to me, but nothing happened. I just didn't talk. I stayed there. He was there for quite a while. And he got up, he looked at me quite seriously, and then eventually he left. I'd recognize him if I saw him again.
How many species of aliens do you think there are?
I think there are many.
That are visiting Earth?
Many. We hear about these archetypal greys and reptilians and Nordics and so forth. This is really a bit childish. There are many subdivisions of aliens exist, believe me.
And what do you think they want from us?
It varies. Some of them, I think, have their beady eye on this planet. Earth is unique in our solar system, and maybe for quite a way around. It's obviously attractive to beings from elsewhere. It's got tremendous resources, it's got a huge amount of water and other resources that they obviously acquire here.
Well, we've talked, of course, about the Vatican's chief astronomer just back in as recently as May, saying that the existence of extraterrestrial life would not be contradictory to the teachings of the Church. Now, some people have suggested they know something and they're just trying to kind of hedge their bets. But actually, through a combination, when the opinion polls are taken on this issue, consistently over 50% of people believe in this sort of thing anyway. So on the day they do announce something, if that day comes, I think an awful lot of people will actually say, yeah, I kind of figured that there was something like that. So I'm not sure there would be the undermining of world religions, panic in the streets, things like that. I think people would say, yeah, so what? We always knew it.
And do you think there is going to be any type of major disclosure soon by a government or a body?
Well, as for genetics, I'm convinced that some aliens have a hybridization program. I'm absolutely 100% convinced of that, and we are part of that. We've been hybridized before, we can be hybridized again, and they probably need materials from us to produce their own hybridized species. As for disclosure, well, it depends what's being disclosed, and if there is disclosure by governments, are we going to get the whole truth? I seriously doubt it. I seriously doubt it. There's going to be spin. They cannot tell us the whole truth. It's got to be gradual.
it's not just members of the public out walking a dog late at night. It's celebrities, it's police officers, it's military pilots. Don't be afraid if you've seen a UFO to make a report to the MOD, to the media, to a UFO group, wherever, because people really are in very good company.
I understand, Nick, that the MOD have recently released some new UFO documents, which the world is obviously keenly interested to know what your opinions are and what you know about them.
Yes, this is an absolutely massive story. On 14th of May 2008, the National Archives released the first batch of UFO files. 8 files out of a total of 160. Now, 8 files doesn't sound much, but when you consider that there are 450 pages of documentation in some of these files, we're talking 2,000 pages of UFO documents just in this first lot alone. This is why this is going to be a 4-year programme with a few new files rolled out every month or so. Within about a week or a week and a half of this material being released, the dedicated website that National Archives had set up had 1.7 million downloads of this, not hits, downloads. These documents are in PDF. Yeah, I mean, it shows the level of interest in this subject. One of the other interesting things was that the French government, when they released their archive of UFO files last year, the dedicated website they set up crashed under the weight of hits. Well, yes, and I know that the National Archives here in the UK were extremely concerned that that would happen here, and that would turn a potentially very good news story, which they regarded this as, into a bad news story. I mean, of course, they had a bad experience when they rolled out some of the census material. That again, so many people were trying to log on and download some of these documents.
Why has there only been 8 released?
A lot of it is because of the time it takes to redact these files.
Meaning?
To black out some categories of information. Under the Freedom of Information Act, there are a number of different exemptions that apply. Some of them are fairly general catch-all terms, like defence, like national security. Some of them are fairly ordinary administrative things. A big one is personal data. And I mean, the whole interface between the Freedom of Information Act and the Data Protection Act is a very complicated situation. But, to put it simply, if a member of the public reports a UFO sighting to the MOD, they don't want to find that something that they've reported in confidence has suddenly been posted all over the internet.
Or left on a train.
And they don't want to see their name in the papers. They don't want some local UFO group turning up on their doorstep saying, "I'd like to talk about the sighting you reported to the MOD." So the MOD must follow the law in this. So some poor person has to go through every sheet of paper.
So we're going to see
by word.
Many years ahead of gradual releases.
It's 4 years they think it's going to take to release the entire archive. Now, of course, some of the older papers have been in the National Archives for many years. So we're really talking about material from the late 70s to the present day.
Right. And in this latest release, have we got anything of particular interest?
It's a mixed bag, it really is. By volume, most of the material is 1 or 2 page summaries of sightings from members of the public.
Right.
There's some public correspondence, dear MOD, what do you think about UFOs? Why don't you tell us the truth about the aliens, etc., etc. There are some policy papers discussing how the MOD handles the subject, for example, when it crops up in the media, when it's raised in Parliament.
Right.
Those policy papers, incidentally, are always the ones that I find most
I
interesting.
was just going to say, they sound quite interesting indeed,
Yes,
because that gets you into the mind of, the MOD.
it does, and one of the interesting things, there's already, I think, a bit of a conspiracy theory starting about this. A lot of people said, well, there's 2,000, I mean, I was speaking, I'll come on later to talk about my personal involvement in all this, but just to indicate perhaps the problem. One journalist said to me, just as this material came out, he said, look, Nick, I'm going to do a story on this, but where do I start?
Yeah.
There's 2,000 pages here. I don't have time to go through it. And I had a quick flick, and most of it looks pretty unexciting.
Yeah.
Now, some conspiracy theorists will say that was exactly the point.
Yeah.
Best place to hide a book, in a library.
Yeah.
Best place to hide a tree, in a forest.
Right.
So maybe some people are suggesting they've deliberately released just about the most unexciting, mundane bunch of reports that they have.
And why would they do that?
To try and downplay the story. I mean, the MOD, I'm sure we'll come on to this, the MOD doesn't know some great sinister truth about extraterrestrials.
Yes.
We don't have extraterrestrial spacecraft or debris in an Air Force hangar somewhere.
No, you've just ruined the whole thing.
Sorry. But neither does the MOD, sort of really like to engage on this subject. It's a difficult one for the department.
Why is that?
It's
What's
a combination.
The real reason? I mean, is it the fact that they don't want to upset people, or is it that they just don't want to talk about it? I mean, what's the real reason?
It's more to do with governments not liking to say we don't know. When you look at the government and the military, obviously you always like to project a sense of strength and power and authority. The suspicion that there might be things in our airspace that run rings around our own aircraft.
Right.
The fact that, yes, from time to time these things have showed up on radar.
Yeah.
The fact that, yes, aircraft have been scrambled and the pilots have seen them and then they've managed to elude them.
Yeah.
That's not a situation that makes people comfortable. Not because they're saying these must be aliens. The MOD doesn't take a position on what these things are. But I think anyone that's really looked into it properly for the government, like myself, has concluded that there's something there, there's something going on.
Well, I mean, at the end of the day, we both know, because we've both been involved in various ways, the MOD are just ordinary people.
Yes.
Like you and me, like everybody else. They're ordinary people and they're interested themselves.
Oh, they are.
They don't necessarily have, a belief system in aliens, but they'd also like to know if it's true. And
Absolutely.
People kind of have this concept that all MOD people are men in black with these special pens, and that they're all lying to us.
Yeah,
all the time.
the MOD, you're
they'd
quite
like
right.
to know too, wouldn't
they? Absolutely. I've met people at the MOD who are fully paid up believers in extraterrestrial visitation.
And are they allowed to join organisations outside of the MOD, UFO organisations?
Yes, there'd be nothing. No, I don't think so. And
that
of
would
course,
be a conspiracy thing, wouldn't it?
well, it would be. And the other thing is, just on general security grounds, when I joined with the threat from the Provisional IRA, now with the threat from Al Qaeda, obviously you're not really supposed to go out and say, hello, I'm in the Ministry of Defence. People wouldn't want to do that as a matter of course. But if an MOD employee wanted to join the British UFO Research Association, as long as they didn't imply some sort of official link that wasn't there, there would be nothing in staff regulations to prohibit that. There would, of course, be an absolute prohibition on breaking the Official Secrets Act and discussing any military or government business, but then that would apply to any MOD employee who wanted to join the local philately society. So
we won't go there.
No. Well, so there are believers at the MOD, there are skeptics at the MOD, there are an awful lot of people in between, just like real life. Now, in a sense, you could say, well, that's not the real issue. The real issue is the people at the MOD who have had some involvement in the UFO project. What are their belief systems? That's a more relevant question, I think.
And has it changed people's belief systems? You know, people within the MOD who have seen reports that you may have collated or whatever, have they come along and gone, well, no, I just don't know?
Yes, that's changed my views.
Right.
I mean, I started that job when I was posted into it in 1991, thinking, well, I'm not going to find anything particularly interesting here. It's all just going to be aircraft lights and weather balloons. I didn't really know what to expect. When I came out of that job 3 years later, I thought, that is interesting.
Even with all the knowledge that you had built up on black technology, etc., that the MOD have got, even you, had come away thinking there may be something.
There may be something, yes. I wasn't prepared to say, hand on heart, I think this must be extraterrestrial. Neither was I prepared to rule out that possibility. I know that's a bit of a politician's answer. But
it is, but it's a fascinating idea that even you, with all the knowledge, insider knowledge, that millions of ufologists around the planet would love to get their hands on, because you obviously know a lot more than most of them. Even with all that knowledge, you think that then there's a possibility.
Yes, and I wasn't the only one.
To me, that's incredible, because you know me pretty well now. You know that I'm not a skeptic. So you went in as a skeptic, saw all the knowledge and information, saw this is a real technology that we have, and you saw all the other stuff, and yet even you have come away thinking it's a possibility.
Yes, and like I say, I wasn't the only one. I remember some discussions we had with opposite numbers in the Defence Intelligence staff were sometimes like something out of a science fiction movie. I remember on one particular occasion, I mean, people always have this little, I mean, there are so many supposed whistleblowers in this field, particularly in America, people who claim to have worked on projects at 47 levels above top secret or whatever they come out with. Most of it nonsense, to be honest, and a lot of charlatans and wannabes in this business.
Is there real? So it's no different to religion.
It's, well, I better not go there. But you hear these stories, but and one of the stories is, what do they call the aliens? And you hear people say the children, the EBEs, extraterrestrial biological entities. I've got a real story about that, not based on absolute certain knowledge of extraterrestrials, but clearly speculation about it. And my boss and I were at a briefing, and the person in the Defence Intelligence staff who was giving the briefing kept using this phrase throughout the briefing, and the phrase was "these people," and that was as close as he was prepared to go. And I remember my boss afterwards shaking his head in consternation. Who are these people? What did he mean by these people? And I said, well, you should have asked. He wouldn't have said. But these people is an interesting choice of phrase.
Reading between the lines.
It certainly implies occupants if you're dealing with craft. And if you meant Russians or Chinese or Americans, then why not say it?
So getting back to these latest releases, is there anything within there that gives us cause to think this is a possibility?
Yes, there are a handful of interesting cases. It's back to the point about best place to hide a book is in a library. Right. Most of the
so do the hard work for us.
All right. Most of the cases, as I say, are just 1 or 2 page summaries. Obviously misidentifications of aircraft lights, weather balloons, bright stars and planets, and meteors. That probably accounts for 80-90% of the material by volume. Okay. But in amongst them there are some interesting...
1,800 pages have gone, we've got 200 pages left.
Yeah, of those, as I say, the policy papers are quite interesting. We'll come on maybe to a little bit of news management later, and how the MOD doesn't exactly, well, spinning the sources, as I call it.
Different terms for propaganda and manipulation.
How to kill a story that you don't like, how to promote a story that you do like.
Yes,
I mean,
a good day for a news release.
Yes,
Yes.
that's the one. With regard to cases, let's just nail this down. In this first batch, there are about half a dozen quite interesting cases, and this takes me back. This might be a useful point to mention the personal involvement I've had in this. Early in 2008, the National Archives actually called me in to preview the material for them, because they'd been passed these files by the MOD, and they, like the journalists, were just going, where do we start? So they thought, hang on a moment, there's this guy who used to work on these files who now does some freelance journalism and some broadcasting on this.
Right.
Why don't we ask him to find the good cases for us?
Right.
So they asked me to come in, and long before the material was actually made public, they set me up with an office at the National Archives, set me in front of a computer terminal, and basically asked me to pick out a selection of cases.
Right.
And I decided to pick out a mixture,
Right.
because I knew that they wanted this story to appeal to a broad range of media. So I picked out some easily explainable cases, some more difficult to explain cases, and one or two slightly quirky cases, so that everything, tabloids, broadsheets, everyone could cover it. And again, maybe we'll talk about the coverage later, but that worked because the story ran not just on, say, the serious programs like Newsnight and CNN News, but the slightly more light-hearted things like maybe 5 News and Sky News.
Right.
And again, it was in the Times and it was in the Sun, so it did have that broad appeal. Now, one of the, I'll mention perhaps one of the slightly easy to explain cases, but I'll tell you why I picked it out.
Right.
Because it is important to stress that most UFOs are misidentifications.
Okay.
And there was this wonderful case where, of all the places that this sighting could have taken place, it was at a pub. And essentially a whole load of customers and the bar staff at this pub saw a very bright white light, and in conjunction with it they saw a red light and a green light. And when they were asked, well, where was this? They said, well, I suppose roughly in the direction of Gatwick Airport, somewhere towards that area.
Yeah.
So, I just thought that was a fun example to pick out. Not implying that these people were stupid, but implying sometimes the power of belief, the power of beer. Yes, I fear alcohol may have played a part in this, but also the way that, particularly when you've got a multiple witness event, there can be a contagious excitement. It's like a meme, whatever you call it, but when you've got one person saying, wow, look at that, and somebody else comes in, it almost becomes a point of, I don't want to be excluded from the group. And that kind of pack mentality, that group mentality, I think has a part sometimes in whipping up almost what hysteria, in a sense.
And that can happen at a distance as well. You can get that on the internet. Somebody can post something, and all of a sudden those sightings are spread, don't they?
Yes, they do.
It doesn't necessarily have to be in the same room or in the same field.
No. Now, sometimes with something like the internet, there can be legitimate reasons, and it may well be that someone has genuinely had a sighting, but because somebody else has spoken about it, they feel more able to discuss a sighting where otherwise they might not have stepped up to the plate because of fear of disbelief or ridicule. But I think when you're dealing with people together, and very often, we're now of course in the YouTube generation, if you put the phrase UFO into YouTube and sort by date, there's something new almost literally every day. And some of these videos have pretty, what I would call X-rated soundtracks as people are going, look at that, and then some very colourful language. And you can see, even if it is just actually, as most of these things are, just a bright light, you can see this the infectiousness of the excitement as people get drawn in. And I think part of it is wanting to be a part of something, and the flip side of that is not wanting to be excluded from something, and which is why psychology plays a very important part in this phenomenon. And
there's a good lesson there, isn't there, for people who are seriously into UFOs and really do want to do good research. I mean, good research is to remain balanced. It's to try and remain separate from the actual event and the people, and to be straight and balanced about it, taking a balanced approach. I mean, what you've just said gives us two sides to the coin. It's a nice balanced approach. Yeah? You can get this infectious thing, as you're pointing out, but also you can miss out on something good if you rule all sightings out as being infectious.
Yes.
So
yes, you've got to go in.
Balanced approach.
Yeah, I mean everything about. I did a couple of studies at the MOD, totally unrelated to UFOs. I led quite a high-profile study, and I deputised on quite a high-profile study. A number of times you heard people say things like, "I hope this isn't going to be a conclusion-led study." In other words, people thought that you'd made a policy decision, or ministers or service chiefs had made a policy decision. They were now trying to put in place a study to give them the justification for it. So that's not the way. Obviously, you must go in and say, what is the exam question? What is the strategic aim of your study? And then you must go in. You must do a number of things. You must amass your evidence, and you must speak to your experts, and then you must analyse what you've got in an even-handed way, as you've said. And this same criteria
it's a good scientific approach. It's absolutely correct.
It is, and it's for example, it's an approach that a police officer would take, and I've often drawn parallels between police investigations and UFO investigations, and indeed I've worked quite closely with military police in the course of my MOD career, and I've learned quite a lot about the investigative methodology. And one cop said to me one day, knowing of the background that I'd done in the UFO job, he said, actually investigating a UFO isn't that difficult isn't that different from me investigating a crime. He said, when you look at what we do, it's very simple. You identify and interview witnesses, and you identify, recover and analyse evidence. And that's it, basically.
So back to these reports. We've had a simple one there that's easy to explain.
Yes.
And we move on to one that's more difficult to explain.
Yes, and actually it brings us to it quite nicely, because it's one that involves police. Some women in a suburb of northwest London saw a UFO. A number of people in the neighbourhood did, and they were quite panicked by what they'd seen. It was quite unusual, and they phoned the local police station. The local police sent out a couple of officers to the scene, and the officers actually saw the UFO themselves.
Really?
And they had the thing under observation, both with the naked eye and binoculars, for about an hour.
Really?
And they produced a very detailed sketch, which is in the MOD file. That was a story that I picked out, and the sketch was run in many of the national newspapers. Shows a spherical object with some sort of ring around it, almost like, imagine something like the planet Saturn, when you see a very close-up NASA picture of it, with very strange coloured lights, not the colours of aircraft lights, not your sort of greens and reds and whites. There were blue lights on this, I think, yellow lights, and things like that. And again, just an interesting example. Again, of course, there is no such thing as the infallible observer, and just because a police officer sees a UFO doesn't somehow make it, absolutely take it to the bank. But in terms of experience of things like estimating speeds and distances, particularly if you're dealing with traffic cops, for example, we do have to face the fact that reports from police officers and pilots do, certainly as far as those of us at the MOD were concerned, elevate it a notch or two above reports from Joe Public.
So that's an unexplained.
That's an unexplained case. Another one,
and things such as local, whether the Ministry of Defence were actually flying anything at that time, etc.
Well, not over the London suburbs, but I mean, of course,
commercial ventures, balloons, all those kinds of things.
The investigative methodology is basically not like the X-Files. It is a series of checks. We know the sorts of things that are misidentified for UFOs, and you can check against them. So all the sorts of things that you've mentioned are things that you check for. Civil aircraft activity, military aircraft activity, weather balloon launches, astronomical data about any bright stars and planets or meteor showers, satellites, re-entry into the Earth's atmosphere of space debris. All these sorts of things are things that those of us at the MOD involved in this had access to and could check for. So what you do is you go through this and you eliminate them. And with these sorts of cases, with the police case that I mentioned, all these conventional explanations were eliminated.
And we were left with not knowing what this
exactly. And then a lot of people say, so what happens then?
Yeah.
And this is the ultimate catch-22 of all that. That's the point, and I'll carry on with the police investigation analogy. That's the time where you say, well, we've interviewed all the witnesses, we've analysed all the forensic evidence, we can't solve it. So now, police officer will say that an unsolved crime is never technically closed, because of course from time to time you will have a cold case review, where you'll come back and revisit unsolved crimes, or a new piece of evidence, a new witness may come to light years after the event.
Now, just a simple question from the way I work with things that I do is when you get something such as that, do you then correlate that with similar sightings that you have in the rest of the country and over different periods?
You do, but the situation is not as sophisticated as it could be. Part of the problem is manpower. Part of the problem is computer programs. You need to build up, and certainly when I was doing the job, the system wasn't yet in place, but your kind of corporate memory. Now, corporate memory can be captured in a number of ways. It can be captured with individuals, but it really needs a proper cross-referenced computer system which is searchable by keywords.
Yes.
We don't yet have that.
I mean, because for me in particular, I would go for size, shape, colour, those kind of things which would need to correlate together.
Indeed, it should be possible. It is possible. The technology exists to put all this information into a database, and then to, for example, say, can you pull up all sightings involving UFOs seen by police officers in September of any year involving red lights?
I do the same thing with names.
Yeah.
People's names, and when I need to find out whether so and so knows another person, and so I have a list of names and companies that they've been involved with and what secret societies they may have been in, etc., etc., and then I can correlate and I can just type a name and find what the links are.
Yeah.
The very, very similar thing could be doing in ufology.
That system, the MOD, as far as I know, they certainly didn't have it in place when I was
amazing.
There.
The 21st century.
You see, bear in mind.
It's so important though.
It is, but bear in mind that government departments are about 5 years behind business in terms of IT.
That's terrible.
But it's true. and I got friends whose background has been in other government departments, even in the intelligence agencies, who always say, well, when everyone in ICI had their own terminal, we sort of had one per office.
So you didn't have an Aston Martin that could go invisible?
Very sadly not.
That's terrible.
Got the odd Bic biro.
Well, I think that we're missing out on a major part of this research.
We are. Now the MOD, to be fair, is developing, I better not go into the specific name because I'm not sure if it's in the public domain. Obviously, as you know, I'm bound by the Official Secrets Act. Even though I've left, it binds me to the day I die.
Yeah.
So if I'm not sure if something's in the public domain or not, I have to assume it's not, and err on the side of caution. I think all I'll say on that is yes, there is a gap. I think the gap has been plugged, not in relation specifically to UFOs, but of course all the things that MOD would benefit from being instantly able to interrogate its databases.
Anti-terrorism is obviously the thing that they may be discussing there at some point. So we've got a simple one that's really not explainable. What about this quirky?
The quirky one was really this. It was a. I don't know whether to call it an alien abduction case. I'll call it an alien contact case.
Right.
This person claimed to have been in psychic and physical contact with an extraterrestrial named Algar for many years, and he was working with Algar, building up towards some sort of disclosure of the extraterrestrial presence.
Okay.
And then there was this line in the letter that said, sadly, Algar was then killed in a battle with another group of extraterrestrials. So that, of course, was that. And I love that line at the end, so that was that. So first contact was about to take place, but then didn't because Algar was killed. And there was another abduction case in there. It's actually been in the public domain for a while. The case of Alfred Berthoud. The chap died some years ago, I think. So the name's in the public domain anyway. So this is one of the names that I don't think had to be redacted.
Right.
Either that or I just remembered the name anyway because it's long been in the public domain. But this was somebody who, whilst fishing, I think at the Basing Canal near Aldershot, claimed that he saw a UFO land and was taken on board and shown around. And just as he thought he was going to go on the trip of a lifetime, he said the aliens turned round and said, "You're too old and infirm for our purposes. You may go." And the wonderful thing is, when he went back and told his wife, she said, "No more fishing for you, old man."
The ultimate alien insult.
So there's a whole mixture of cases just in this first batch. There were a couple of very interesting sightings from pilots. One pilot described how an object passed within 1.5 nautical miles of the aircraft, and again, some of these files are almost surreal because the people are reporting as they're speaking. And obviously this pilot was pretty aggrieved by the situation. He said, "I can only think this was A meteor, B, space debris, or C, a missile being test fired." He said, "If it is C," he said, "my crew and I are most displeased." So, and there are some wonderful things. There was another a very interesting case involving two UFOs, not a visual sighting at all, but it was picked up on the airborne radar system of a Sea King helicopter, I believe it was, down at Culdrose base in Cornwall. And two UFOs were tracked on military radar, travelling 10 nautical miles in 12 seconds. The assessment was given, yes, some radar systems are twitchy, radar's not infallible, you do get ghost returns, but we don't think these were ghost returns. We don't think this was attributable to weather. So that was interesting. Couple of, again, most UFO sightings are sort of fairly vague lights or shapes in the sky. One of the reports was almost a classic Close Encounters spaceship. the witness was estimating that he said this thing was the size of 2 football fields,
Right.
festooned with different coloured lights. I mean, either the guy was making it up, or he saw something totally above and beyond the conventional. There's really not much middle ground with a case like that.
When you were researching these things, did you ever take a psychological analysis of the individual?
It's very difficult to do that. Firstly, it was outside the terms of reference. I'll come back on to psychology in a minute, if I might. I just wanted to mention. I'll mention the last of the interesting cases in this first batch, and those are what I call the so-called car stop cases. You remember at the beginning of the film Close Encounters of the Third Kind, where he's driving along in his car, and the classic scene with the headlights, and then the car overtakes him, and then the next set of lights behind, and then rise straight up. Next thing, his engine starts cutting out, the radio starts coming on and off. Electromagnetic interference. It's reported a fair bit in relation to this phenomenon. It's interesting physical evidence that something's interacting with the vehicle. A couple of cases like that. One case with the fan in the car coming on and off, the engine cutting in and out.
And this is whilst they're having the sighting?
Yes. So those are the sorts of interesting things that are in there. What I say to people is if you're interested in UFOs, okay, I can help you pick out the interesting cases, but it might actually be worth your while ploughing through it yourself, so you can get that overview and realise that very important point that most UFO reports are actually quite mundane. When I was reviewing this material for the National Archives, for the first half hour or so, I was quite excited. I was thinking, it's like being back in the saddle, it's bringing back memories of what it's like. After a couple of hours, I was bored senseless.
Right.
It was, A, because I'd seen all the material before, and B, because most of it was I was walking my dog late at night and I saw this funny white light in the sky.
I must admit, that's the kind of, when we last met, I was not really deeply into UFOs at all, or aliens or anything, but since that time I've been dragged kicking and screaming into that world, and so I've taken a deeper look. And I must admit, reading through a lot of the reports, I'm brought to tears.
Yes.
Most of the time.
Yes.
But there is probably within me and within you and within most people who are interested in this, that little glimmer of something which keeps you looking.
Absolutely.
You've come away from the MOD, even though most of those reports are boring, etc., still not knowing.
Yes.
In fact, coming from a position more towards the believer than you were before you went in.
Yes, and the other thing, particularly when I was doing that job, is you never knew what the next phone call was going to be. And you never knew when you opened up a letter whether it would have in it one of the most spectacular photos of a UFO that you'd ever seen, which you could then take to the MOD technical specialists and they could work their wizardry. You never knew. You knew statistically that the next phone call was probably going to be misidentification of the planet Venus, but
did you always tell the person what conclusion you'd come to? So if you had a report, you would always give them one back?
I would always try to back brief, yes, and that was interesting because sometimes people would accept it and say, oh, thank you very much. Sometimes people would sound rather disappointed. They thought they'd had some wonderful experience, and you say, actually, I found out that there was a big airship and it was filming the European Cup final game that they were showing it wherever. And people go, I thought I'd seen something. And the third reaction was sometimes you would get downright hostility and disbelief. No, it wasn't. I know what I saw. I'm not an idiot. Oh, you would say that. You're part of the cover-up.
Absolutely.
You're just trying, and I would become the bad guy.
Yeah.
So, yes, I would try to back brief people because I thought it was my duty and I thought it would be helpful. But
Yeah.
the reaction that I then got from the original witnesses varied.
In all honesty, then I have to ask this, because there's conspiracy people out there. You never really did ever give a false back brief, just
No.
to stop people from maybe, even if it was black technology.
Well, I have never given a false back brief. The whole, black technology, black projects is obviously an area that I can't discuss in any great
Yeah.
detail. Suffice to say, I think the whole UFO community sometimes overplay this black project theory massively. Yes, of course, there will always be prototype aircraft and UAVs being test flown, but we know where, and we know where we don't do these things, and I think you can disentangle black projects from UFOs to a huge, if not total, extent. I can't really answer the hypothetical. If somebody had seen some prototype and I knew that they had, I probably wouldn't have told them anything. That way I wouldn't have told a lie.
Yes.
It's funny. Let's come on to that, because but it's a question that comes up time and time again, and I know a lot of conspiracy theorists disbelieve this, but in my experience, the one thing that you will taught from day one is that you don't lie. You don't lie to ministers, you don't lie to Parliament, you don't lie to the press. And if, for example, if you put a brief up and it contains an untruth, and a minister repeats that untruth in Parliament, by convention that minister must resign, even if it's not a deliberate mistruth. Well, let me slightly qualify that. On a small point, provided the minister comes back and says, I apologise for inadvertently having misled the House, that is recoverable. But if there's anything major, and certainly if there's any deliberate attempt to tell a falsehood, that's an absolute resignation offence. For a civil servant, it would be a very serious disciplinary offence, penalty for which could include instant dismissal.
So better therefore not to say it.
Yeah, it's quite acceptable to say that's not something I can comment on. It's quite acceptable, again, perhaps we'll come on to this later, but it's acceptable, and people do it all the time, of course, to talk up a good news story and play down a bad news story. And I think you can see that happen not just in government, but in business. Look, let's take a classic example. Supposing a major company posts its profit figures, and for a particular quarter, and they're not as good as expected. It doesn't say, these figures are really terrible, and this is a complete disaster, because of course it's going to push the share price down even further. What they say is, well, actually, although it's not quite as high as we hope, we've got to bear in mind the wider economic situation, and set against a global downturn, we think these figures are actually pretty good given the situation, and you're talking it up.
Yes.
It happens all the time, and you see football managers do it. Well, it's I still think that he's going to be fit for the next FA Cup match, and part of it is what many managers call kidology, of course.
So, are you telling us that you are maybe taught in the Ministry of Defence, in positions that you were in, how to spin?
I wasn't. Okay. I have been media trained by the MOD, and that certainly covers sort of general media awareness, and gives you an idea of those sorts of issues. I was not a press officer. It's the press officers who have the direct interface with the media. I've helped draw up news briefs. Now the point is, with a news brief, and it comes back to this point, it must be truthful. Let's take a bad news story. Let's take say, the crash of a military aircraft and say the death of a pilot. Well, the first thing you must do is have the absolute facts. This is when it happened. This is what the aircraft was. This is, the details of the casualty. And you can't lie about this. You can't pretend it didn't happen. You can't cover it up. You have to face the facts and make an announcement. But what you do in a situation like that is you will your first thing is always your people, and say this is a terrible tragedy and at this very difficult time. Our thoughts and sympathies go to the family and friends of the pilot who tragically lost his life in this incident. Then you will look at the facts of the case. Now, with an aircraft accident, because there's automatically going to be a board of inquiry, your position is, if the media are saying, well, come on, this aircraft, this model of aircraft is now 30 years old, this was bound to happen, wasn't it? You can. I'm sort of reluctant to use the phrase hide behind, but because there's going to be a board of inquiry, because it's very important, you don't prejudice it, you can bat away all questions like that. You can say, well, it would be improper to speculate at this stage in advance of the board of inquiry, but I can assure you that in order to find answers for the family and to ensure that something like this never happens again, we will get to the bottom of this incident, and we will ensure that lessons are learned if there are indeed lessons.
I suppose with such really good media training, this is one of the reasons why conspiracy theorists think that maybe there is a lot of spin going off in the MOD world and world of ufology, because this is quite clever stuff for most people. For me, this is normal because I have to do it for a living.
Yeah.
So, but for the rest of people, they sit there and listen to the politician waffle and think he's actually said something. We sit there for an hour and say, well, he's just spent an hour saying nothing.
Well, one of the classic things is when I hear someone on Newsnight, when somebody puts a really difficult point, when someone says, well, we are where we are.
Absolutely. That's not the question. The question is, but that's very clever stuff. It's very high level training that you're talking about, really. This is not something that is taught to everybody.
No, it's not.
No.
And it works.
So can you see why conspiracy theorists think that
course
maybe... I mean, even I've been accused of being in psyops.
As have I.
Several times, I know for a fact. People have said to me, why are you doing films with Nick Pope? Because he's obviously out to lie to us because of his background, etc., etc.
Or to be propagator of disinformation.
Yes.
To be maybe the friendly face.
You naughty man.
Yes.
It's disgusting. You shouldn't do it.
It works in reverse as well, and I'll give you an interesting example. We talked about how the MOD and the other thing, just taking that analogy of an aircraft accident. Very often, and this is true, but very often, of course, there have been cases where pilots have probably lost their lives because they've stayed with the aircraft long enough to steer it away from a village, and in doing so have paid the ultimate price, but have taken the decision that they have to do that and take a chance, rather than have the aircraft head towards say a village where it might hit a school or a hospital or something like that. If there's the slightest suspicion that happened, of course the MOD and the Air Force would push that point and say it does look as if he stayed with his aircraft to steer it away from, and again, none of this is lying.
No.
What this is doing is highlighting positive parts of a story and downplaying negative parts of a story. Yes, it's an old airframe. But
what you're saying is it's not to hide something that you already know. It's not. You're not trying to hide the fact that you've got an alien in a ship in our airbase.
Exactly. If you have a board of inquiry, the board of inquiry concludes that the aircraft crashed because a particular part wasn't fitted properly. there are no two ways about it. Once that Board of Inquiry is out, the MOD has to bite the bullet and say, in this case, this accident was attributable to error in terms of a part that failed, or human error in terms of a mistake that was made in maintenance. Now, even then, you will say, but let's just remember that this aircraft, this type of aircraft, has flown for hundreds of thousands of hours without incident. But having said this, sometimes
more people die with coconuts landing on their heads. Yeah.
Well, we wouldn't quite do that one. And again, if there was a death, of course, you would bring it back to the human tragedy, and you would say, and the other thing is, sometimes an apology can simple, straight apology can be a very sophisticated strategy.
Yeah.
We made a very serious mistake here. Tragically, somebody paid for it with their lives. We can only apologise and do everything within our power to ensure that a tragedy like this does not occur again. So I can assure members of the House, the families and the public that lessons have been learned from this tragedy.
Now that's a method that ought to be used a little bit more.
Yes, but that's an honest admission of fault, but you will find that all the time. If you go into the MOD website and look at particularly some of the boards of inquiries into deaths of personnel in Iraq and Afghanistan, into aircraft accidents, you will find some fairly frank admissions of fault. So that's a part of the culture. Let me tell you how it works in reverse, and let me bring it back to UFOs. It's quite interesting. Sometimes you will see in the papers, in documents, the MOD use phrases like UFO spotters, and doing everything they can to create a sort of nerdy, Anorak-ish image of the UFO lobby.
So let me just find out what you just said. You just said that the MOD do everything they can to create a nerd.
They have used language let's go back to basics. There was a document, I think it dates from 1965, where the MOD set out its views on UFOs to the US government, and there was a line, and I don't have the document in front of me, but it's words to the effect of, "It has been our long-standing policy to downplay this subject." Very telling phrase, which really gets to the heart of what I'm talking about. It's not it's been our long-standing policy to cover up the truth about the crashed UFO that we have at RAE Farnborough.
Yeah.
That's not what it is.
Farnborough, you said.
But it has been our policy to downplay this subject, and it goes back to what I was saying about the embarrassment of not knowing. What is this phenomenon? Well, most of it's misidentifications, but some we're not sure. Yes, they're seen by pilots, sometimes our own Air Force pilots. Yes, they're tracked on radar. Yes, there are some good photos and videos. Yes, sometimes pilots and radar combined paint a picture of speeds and manoeuvres that we can't match. That's not an area that MOD feels comfortable with. It's not an area that it particularly wants to highlight. Thinking and language is very important, and in fact there was a module of psychology called Thinking and Language, which was just about how the words that we use are not neutral words, but they're loaded words. This is, I know, bread and butter to you. So for example, you will often hear, or you did often hear, say in the 70s, things like the unions have rejected management's latest offer. Well, that makes management sound, that make management are generous because they're making an offer. What a nice friendly word that is. Yeah. Unions rejected something. It's not. It was seldom put the other way round. Management refused to match the union's request. Unions tended to demand things.
So what you're saying, that the moral of this is, for any UFO researcher watching this, is read very carefully the news on UFOs that you are reading. Any statements from official bodies.
Yes.
Be very careful and clever in how you read them.
Yes, and look at the language in which you, the UFO lobby, are described in the MOD documents, and you'll find. I mean, there was one classic paper. It started. We've heard from the UFO spotters again, and there's been. I think this, and sometimes I wasn't there, but sometimes you can almost, I think, detect a sigh in the tone of voice of the press officer talking to the journalist, and doing their best to sort of say, well, we only are really our only interest.
Like the classic Close Encounters film, when they're all at the press conference with the government and they're really playing them down there again, aren't they? And there's the kind of plant that's in there. I saw Bigfoot once. You know, it's similar kind of things. Spielberg may have been pointing out there that it was going on.
Yes, and I'm afraid I was guilty of this myself.
Nick Pope, guilty.
In that, when I was doing some of the tie-in media, let me just explain how the file release actually worked, the mechanics of it. As I say, I got called in to preview the material and select some cases for highlighting in the media. There was an embargoed press release. This was the way that the thing was handled. There was an embargoed press release, which, if you knew about it, and if you were an accredited journalist, you could get yourself on a distribution list, and you could get that press release sent to you on Monday the 12th of May, embargoed until midnight on the 14th. It was midnight 13th, 0001 14th. So I was going around with the full authority and indeed request of the National Archives, getting as many of my TV, radio and newspaper media contacts as possible onto that distribution list by saying to them that the MOD is going to release this first batch of files. I can't tell you when, but it's going to be very soon. Here's the contact at the press office. Get yourself on the list. You'll get an embargoed press release. Then once you've got that, let's chat and do a story. Consequently, everyone had 2 days to do some sort of research, do some sort of pre-recording interview, book people to come into the studio, and then on the day, it was blanket media coverage, like I say. It was on everything from Newsnight and ITN News through to 5 News, Sky News, The Times, The Sun. All the national newspapers carried it. I was literally doing radio interviews in the back of the courtesy car taking me from one TV studio to another. I mean, and as I said, 1.7 million downloads in the first week and a half, and international coverage too. I mean, I was on Larry King Live discussing this. German TV, Italian TV. I mean, there's something about this subject that still captures the public imagination. But even I fell into the I won't say the trap, but I used the phrase "little green men," and I think I got pulled up on it by some within the UFO lobby, because again, like UFO spotters, it's a phrase that can be used to disparage the subject and the people involved with it.
And we all know that they're great.
Well, that hadn't been my intention, but I had said something like, there simply is no saucer in a hangar smoking gun. There are no little green men in these files. However, there are some interesting cases with UFOs tracked on radar, seen by pilots, etc.
I think we'll forgive you.
Yeah, invariably, all the newspapers though did carry the little green men comment. I didn't say it in a disparaging way. Had I meant to do so, I could have done so.
Yes.
And I've seen phrases from the MOD. It's interesting.
The point is, it's how easily you can be accused of
Yes.
being a disinfo guy.
Yes.
Because you used that one phrase and it came out. Which
Indeed.
most of us would have, there is no little green men.
Yeah.
But it's off the cuff almost.
It would be interesting for any researcher to apply under the Freedom of Information Act for the news brief that press officers were working off on the day of the file release, because there's a standard format to these things, starting off with the key messages, but also having defensive lines to take on questions that might be raised, where you wouldn't volunteer something, but if it is raised, you'll deal with it. They're very interesting news briefs if you can get hold of them. Very often, though, they're covered by some of the exemptions under the Freedom of Information Act. But I've seen some of them released on other subjects from time to time. It's an interesting thing that the UFO lobby might try to put some flesh on the bones of the background to all this.